Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. You may not have heard of Bertram L. Baker. He was a West Indian immigrant who rose to become a Democratic Party boss in Brooklyn, and in 1948 became the first black person to be elected to office from that borough when he won a seat in the New York State Assembly. Baker's political savvy led to the election of black judges and other office holders, paving the way for the likes of current New York City public advocate Letitia James and Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams. Written by his grandson, journalist Ron Howell, Boss of Black Brooklyn, The Life and Times of Bertram L. Baker is more than a biography of an accomplished, though flawed man. It's also the story of how West Indian immigrants changed the face of politics in New York City, about a much-maligned but vibrant Brooklyn neighborhood, Bedford Stuyvesant, and a moving family story about how Baker influenced those closest to him. The book is published by Fordham University Press. Welcome. You virtually grew up in the home of Bertram Baker, your mother's father. But during that time, you knew little or nothing about the seminal role he played in Brooklyn politics. When did you start to find out?
I would say it was considerably after he retired. He retired in 1970.
Okay.
Retired in 1970, and he did a talk at the Brooklyn Historical Society in 1976, and I was working for the Baltimore Evening Sun at the time, and the word went out to family members that he was going to be giving this talk, and he wanted all of his family to be there, so we came up from Baltimore, and in some ways that was my introduction, because it was a talk of about an hour, and it was very, he went into black political history, say from 1900, and took it up to his election and a little even beyond, and obviously it stayed in my mind, and then just before he died, it occurred to me that there was no audio record, and I spent time with him while he was in bed. Interviewing him. I listen to it now, and the interviews are terrible, and the quality is terrible, but I still have them.
Okay, and you started to extract the story. He came to Brooklyn from the tiny Caribbean island of Nevis in 1915, part of a wave of West Indians, I guess, and also other African-American blacks who started immigrating to Brooklyn in the early 1900s, when blacks made up only 1% of Brooklyn's population. Why Brooklyn? Why? What was the attraction of Brooklyn?
I think Brooklyn was at a point where it was starting to draw people. Well, one interesting connection is that he was born in 1898, and 1898 was the year of the consolidation of Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx into
New York City.
Into New York City. And there were a lot of old Brooklynites at the time who were resentful of it, and they were very much against it and referred to it for a long time as the mistake of 1898. But it was a sign that New York realized that New York City, Manhattan, to realize its potential, it was going to have to pull in Brooklyn. And that's when Italians and Jews from Eastern Europe started flocking here. It was right around the same time.
Okay.
So I would say that the attraction was the same that pulled those Italians and Jews who came to. Also Irish, although the Irish had been coming decades even earlier. And
it was probably cheaper and less crowded than in Manhattan. Probably that's a factor. So he came, his father, who was a Methodist minister, and his two uncles were already here. And Bertram, who had not quite finished high school, lived with one of his uncles. He had wanted to be an Episcopal priest, but decided that was going to be too hard for someone without a college education. So he did odd jobs, and he got a certificate in bookkeeping, and started to do taxes and bookkeeping for individuals and small businesses. He also got married to his cousin. Both were light-skinned with straight black hair. So there had to be some white blood in the past. Where did that come from?
Came from, I've only been able to go back so far with my grandfather. The DeGrasse connection, which he actually identified with, I think even more so than the baker, was obviously French. And it was the Admiral DeGrasse who, his defeat was right there at St. Kitts, of St. Kitts, Nevis. The bakers obviously were, British and also from Scotland. And I have photos. His own father could have passed for white. His mother was darker.
But certainly at that time, being fair-skinned, having what they call good hair, was a social asset within the black community.
I believe so.
The Irish controlled the Democratic Party in Brooklyn at that time, picked who would run for office on the Democratic ticket, who got what jobs with the party. How did Bertram get involved with the Democratic Party, and why did he want to get involved?
I think he became involved with the Democratic Party because he saw that was the way to be successful in Brooklyn. And he was good at that. He was good at seeing the handwriting on the wall, as it were. And I think also he, being a very practical person who took advantage of opportunities, he saw that just about all the blacks in Brooklyn were Republicans, and they were going with the Republican Party. But it was the Democratic Party that was in power and growing in Brooklyn.
Okay.
And my sense was, too, that the West Indian immigrants, which might have offended some native-born blacks, did not embrace the Republican Party, which is the party of Lincoln. Blacks here saw the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln. And he did not have that connection, so it was easier for him to go out on the street and try to get signatures for the Democratic candidates. And I found that was true of some of the other West Indian immigrants as well. They just found it easier to step into the ranks of the Democratic Party, and it was beneficial to them.
He organized his own political club, the United Action Democratic Association, whose goal was to break down barriers to blacks getting political appointments, getting elected to office, judgeships. Basically, it was interesting, you gave me examples. Through a system of tit for tat, he'd throw the weight of his club behind candidates who were favored by the party and would receive favors back from the party leaders. What were some of the jobs that he was able to win for other blacks as a result of his tit for tat?
Well, the most significant for him, it's pretty clear, was the Deputy Collector of Internal Revenue, which came in 1939. And it was something, I assume that it had been on his mind for a while, and it had been known to be one of those civil service jobs that you really wanted if you were looking for some stability and fairly decent salary. I mean, it wasn't going to make you rich, and you used it together with other things. And he was able to receive that appointment in 1939, and at the time he was very pleased. It's just that he did not stay there very long.
He was chosen several times by the party to run for city council, but lost. But was hired by the Brooklyn Borough president to be his confidential inspector. Was that his first steady public job?
Yes, it was. And he took a lot of pride in that. I think the title itself was meant to convey a certain influence that perhaps carried more than the salary did in terms of its impact and benefit to the family. But just think of it, you're the confidential inspector to the borough president of Brooklyn, who was the most significant.
That means.
Yeah, that's right. Well, at the time it was significant, because they helped to make laws. I mean, more so than now. There were big changes in the last 30 years. But the borough presidents would get together and they would have votes and essentially be counterparts to the mayor at that time. So it was a significant, and he carried a badge, by the way. He carried a badge that said confidential.
Must have been a badge. In 1948, he reached a deal with District Leader Stephen Kearny. It's kind of complicated machinations, but as a result, Baker was nominated for an assembly seat. He won, the first black elected official from Brooklyn. He was 50 years old, and he would serve in the assembly for 22 years,
Yes.
ultimately becoming majority whip. What were some of his legislative accomplishments in this assembly?
Well, as with lots of elected officials, each year you're passing through laws that will benefit your community. But for him, the most significant was a Metcalfe Baker bill. And it seems to me when I was young, I would always hear it the reverse, the Baker-Metcalfe bill. It was him with his counterpart in the state Senate. It was a George Metcalfe. And it was a law that barred discrimination, racial discrimination in the sale or rental of housing that had received government assistance. And it was the first in the state, one of the first in the nation, and he was proud of that until his death, and I think George Metcalfe, his counterpart, was as well.
And you noted that at that time, I mean, huge housing complexes like Stuyvesant Town, I think had 10,000 units, moderately priced, but blacks were totally barred from those dwellings. While he was climbing so these are some of the jobs that he got, but he also was able to get judgeships for black candidates. Several, I think, were elected to the city council because he put his backing behind them.
Yes.
While he was climbing the political ladder, he was also climbing the social ladder in Black Brooklyn. He joined a lodge of Masons, which was a black male fraternal organization with various rituals. And this was considered an elite club, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
And it had been, Booker T. Washington had been a member.
Oh.
W.B. Du Bois as well.
Yes, yes. They were said to have been the strivers of that time.
Yeah.
And he joined in 1931, so he would have been 33. And they called him the kid, the youngster.
Oh, really?
Of the lodge in Brooklyn. And it went back to the beginnings of the 1900s in Brooklyn and way further back in the country, named after Prince Hall, who wasn't able to make his way through the Masons that emerged from Europe. So he started one, the Prince Hall Masons for blacks. And it became a significant part of his life. I titled that chapter his Search for a Band of Brothers. And he embraced them as brothers.
Until he was kicked out.
Until he was kicked out.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with author and journalist Ron Howell after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Ron Howell, author of Boss of Black Brooklyn, The Life and Times of Bertram L. Baker. I was saying before, he got kicked out of the Masons because he had, I guess in his newspaper column, he had revealed some inner struggles within the Masons, and they didn't like that very much.
That's right.
But he was also involved with the American Tennis Association, which I had not heard of before. But this was the organization that allowed blacks who were not allowed into the USTA to have their own tournaments.
That's right.
At black college campuses.
That's right. That's right. And black tennis goes back to about 1890 in the United States. In fact, on the campus of Tuskegee. So we can say, too, that it was Booker T. Washington who really gave birth to black American tennis. And, you know, he's really not known for that, but it's a fact. And it seemed to be West Indians who really added power, body and spirit to it as the 1900s moved along. And one of them was a fellow named Gerald Norman, who was born in the 1880s in Jamaica and came, and he started the American Tennis Association in New York. And he was based in New York, from Harlem, and started it in 1916. He was the executive secretary. the executive secretary was essentially the boss of black tennis. And he stayed until 1936 as the boss of the American Tennis Association, and Bertram Baker moved in to take his place and held that spot for the next 30 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And again, this was another connection to other middle-class blacks.
Yes.
Not just in Brooklyn, but around the country. And he took pride in the fact that he negotiated with the white tennis officials to let Althea Gibson compete in their tournaments. And of course, she wound up winning the U.S. Open and Wimbledon.
Yes.
Bertram, you used this word earlier. He was a striver. Describe his demeanor.
I hope he's not standing behind me. I may. I was always afraid to speak my mind around him, but I remember him for his pot belly.
Okay.
That he used to like to rub. And I think a lot of the blacks from the South as well as from the West Indians who were making it in the world, especially during the Depression, who were able to provide for their families, and not only that, but eat well and entertain. Mm-hmm. I think they took a certain delight in having that protrusion around. And so for me, it was that. But it was also, he had a certain comfort in his face. People described him as handsome. A lot of it had to do, of course, with, I think he was described in the archives, birth archives in Nevis as mulatto. And I think, in the United States as well as in the Caribbean, there was a certain advantage in that. And he had a certain air of superiority.
Yeah.
About him, and it was in the way he spoke. There's so many people who just assume that he went to, if not Oxford or Cambridge, then some other British college.
He acted like he did.
He spoke like he did, and a lot of it was reading and just, almost like acting, I suppose.
Right.
He turned himself into that kind of person.
And the suits and the wire-rimmed
always,
glasses.
Yeah, the blue suits, gray suits, black.
In 1954, when the Democrats created a new assembly district, the 6, which was, Bedford Stuyvesant basically, they named him the district leader. What power does a district leader have that he didn't have before? What can a district leader do?
Well, back then, because it was closer to the age of when Tammany ruled especially in Manhattan, but throughout New York City, party bosses, and the district leader was the boss.
Okay.
It was the neighborhood boss.
Okay.
So he was the boss of Bed-Stuy. They were the conduit to jobs, really. I mean, it wasn't until later, as the decades moved along in the 1900s that civil service came in,
So it was about patronage primarily.
It was about patronage primarily.
Getting people jobs.
You would say. But it was at the top of the list probably even now, although so many even voters are not aware of it. It's a selection of judges.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the 60s, Baker started to clash with a new breed of black politicians who were coming in, and maybe more militant, who saw Bertram as old school. He and Shirley Chisholm did not get along well.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Did they hate each other, or strong dislike? What was that about?
I see it as a strong dislike, although my grandfather, in the moments when he would just release some of his wisdom to me, said that anger and the hatred that comes with it is a bad thing. And he said, never let yourself be controlled by it, because it will destroy you, not the person who you are, angry about. So I don't recall any words that would have been on the face of what he said, interpreted as anger. But it was clear there was some almost visceral feeling of that he was not respected in the way that he should have been by her.
And And he was a chauvinist too, as a lot of West Indians.
And I would say that 80% of it had to do with West Indian chauvinism.
Okay. You talk about what made him leave politics ultimately.
It was a combination of the reform movement as it was manifested in the 1960s, sort of overtaking him and the newcomers rising. You had people like Al Vann, who became the assemblyman in his district after he retired, but in the 1960s was in the African American Teachers Association, and was one of those who would have been called at the time militants, and very conscious of being black, and they were very much involving themselves politically. And while he was able, Bertram Baker, to take advantage politically, and even have lawyers show up, for instance, when they were at protests, he was not philosophically comfortable with them. And then slowly he could see where the winds were going.
Yeah.
And there were some of his loyalist followers were starting to move to rival clubs. And again, as he could do so well, he was seeing the writing on the wall. And when he announced his retirement in 1970, it was pretty clear that he would not survive another 2 or 4 years as the assemblyman.
You write about Baker's influence on you and the gratitude that you felt towards him and his wife, Irene. Why? What did you get from Bertram Baker as a grandson?
And my realization came, later in life after he retired. But I grew up in his house, and but I was in his house because my father had left us. He was an alcoholic. He was probably was hoping at some point, deep inside, to be part of Bertram Baker's club himself. He was in law school. He was in Brooklyn Law School, and drank his way out.
So you got a stable, comfortable home. That was one thing you got.
That's right.
But he also got you into a high school that you wouldn't have gotten into otherwise.
Yes.
Used his influence.
Yes.
To get you into Brooklyn Prep, Jesuit High School, the only black kid in your class. You participated in his little league, his pony leagues. You went around the country with him to the tennis tournaments. He really, I think you said you wouldn't have the life that you have now without him.
I say sometimes that I might have ended up strung out on heroin the way a number of acquaintances did, or killed, murdered. I knew youngsters, when I was 14 and they were 14, who were murdered because it was an era of gang fighting throughout Bed-Stuy and the use of heroin, and folks were dying from it, not to mention being arrested for selling marijuana. And had we and my mother and I stayed in the Fort Greene projects, it very possibly, if not likely, would have happened. And it was only because my father was suffering the way he did from the alcohol, and my mother was stricken with polio.
Yeah.
And this was at the same time as he
Right.
dropped out of law school, and my mother just could not walk anymore, and my grandparents took us in. So there's no doubt in my mind that they saved me from a very different life.
Your book is suffused by your great love for Brooklyn. And you're concerned, we got about a minute left, you're concerned about it had gone from 1% black to, I think, a third black, and now you're concerned about its gentrification, that it might wind up being a largely white borough, the way it was when your grandfather came.
Yes. They would be stunned if I were able to bring them back, my grandmother and grandfather, and have them walk with me through Bed-Stuy. I don't believe they'd be able to speak for
Really?
a good half hour at the changes, because when I was there with them in the 1950s, I recall one white family on the block, and they were sisters, Irish sisters who lived right across the street. And they were the remnants of the Irish who had been there. And they had all left. They went to, some to Queens, but mostly to Long Island, to Nassau and Suffolk. And they were just gone. You know? They were just gone. And so it became a black community, and some called it a black ghetto. But
it was not a ghetto to you.
For me, it was home.
It was wonderful.
You know? And for me and my friends who are still there, we love the place, and we love it now. And are just trying to figure out how we cope psychologically and in other ways with a part of us that is being lost, and there's no getting around it now that it's being lost.
Well, it's really a very interesting book, both about this character, your grandfather, who really was a character, about, you know, the way black politics developed in Brooklyn, about Bedford Stuyvesant, which many people labeled a ghetto because it was all black, but which was really a very vibrant community for you, and about his impact on you.
Yes.
And so I thank you for the book, and I encourage our listeners to read it. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Cheryl.
We're out of time. I want to thank Ron Howell for joining me today. His book, Boss of Black Brooklyn, The Life and Times of Bertram L. Baker, published by Fordham University Press, is available online and in stores now. For One to One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.